Do you have a CPAP you can't wear due to the recent recall? Do you snore? I'm Dr. Suzanne Mericle, and my team and I offer and are focused on dental sleep medicine in our practice.
A successful dentist, the owner of a practice on a Ritzy island in the South, now according to police, an alleged killer. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. So often we talk about stories of people who lose everything in one night, in one decision. This is a story about someone who lost their life, allegedly at the hands of someone who has everything. This is Dr. Suzanne Mericle. She's a dentist in Georgia who owns a practice on St. Simon's Island. St. Simon's is a postcard town with a beachy southern charm. It's popular with tourists looking to get away. She owns Mericle Dentistry on St. Simon's, right on Main Street. It's a practice with the tagline, "Anything is possible with a miracle," according to Google. While her practice is in this picturesque place, what police say happened about a 5 hours drive away in Gainesville, Georgia may mean she'll never do a cleaning again. Let's go to March 8th. That's a Saturday when deputies say they received a call around 1 o'clock in the morning. The call was that someone had been shot. Here's the home where deputies were dispatched to. When you look at satellite images, you can see it is right on Lake Lanier. Now, that's a lake about an hour away from Atlanta, and if you have a home on the water there, it is very likely it would go for a lot of money, easily over $1 million in many cases. When deputies arrived at the home, they arrested Mericle and said that she had shot her boyfriend with a gun. His name was James David Barron. The 68-year-old had a wound in the torso. He was taken to a nearby hospital, the Northeast Georgia Medical Center, and that is where he died. Deputies say the 61-year-old dentist was in a relationship with that man, and they both lived in that home. They also say Mericle was there and was arrested. She's now charged with felony murder. She's also charged with aggravated assault under the Family Violence Act. That's a law specific to Georgia that can elevate charges in cases of domestic violence. Mericle is also charged with a felony for possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. According to her Facebook, Mericle knew how to handle a gun, or at least she was familiar with guns. She posted this picture on her Facebook page doing target practice at a range. Deputies say she was arrested later in the day on Saturday in the afternoon. Now, if you're a regular viewer of our content here on Law&Crime, you know that someone's background or their income does not disqualify them from being accused of some very serious crimes. But these stories are shocking when they come across, when you think of everything that someone could potentially lose if they're found guilty. Mericle seemed to be riding a wave of success, and someone, it appears, who people really looked up to. She posted on Facebook how she was a speaker at a major Women in DSO, which stands for Dental Service Organization event in 2023.
Do you have a CPAP you can't wear due to the recent recall? Do you snore? I'm Dr. Suzanne Mericle, and my team and I offer and are focused on dental sleep medicine in our practice. If you have been diagnosed with sleep apnea, mild, moderate, or severe, and can't wear a CPAP, we can help you be fitted for a customized sleep appliance that covers both the upper and lower teeth and pulls your lower jaw slightly forward.
She owned this successful dental practice, and we noticed as the news of her arrest had been made public, patients were shocked to see that their dentist is now charged with murder. Look at this comment that reads, quote, "She had to be living a double life. She was my kid's dentist. Literally had an appointment this Monday the 10th. Wild." Now, we haven't heard Mericle's side to what happened in the early morning hours of March 8th. It's unclear what her relationship with this victim was like and what her defense may be if this case goes to trial. Joining us now is former NYPD detective and host of the Gold Shield podcast, Tom Smith. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, as always, as we break this case down. I know you've probably responded to calls just like this one. When you're let's start in the cruiser. You're on your way to this call that was made. If you're a responding officer that you know someone was shot in the home, what's that drive like as you're trying to anticipate what you're going to see?
Well, that's the whole thing. You try to game plan it as you're getting there, what to look for, what you want to do. The biggest thing when it comes to a scene like that, immediately is already a crime scene. So preserving that crime scene is going to be most important to the responding detectives. separating who you need to, but most of all, making it safe. There's a report of a gun that's there. So your initial reaction and your initial response is going to be one of safety. Who else is in there? Are there any other victims? Is there anyone being held against their will? And the safety of myself and the fellow officers showing up. So there's a lot going on in your mind, but of course, your safety is paramount. And then you proceed forward with the crime scene and witnesses and all that, preparing it for the detectives to show up.
And when you enter the home, because from what we understand about this case, you have the suspect who shot her live-in boyfriend in what was apparently a really nice house on a lake in Georgia. And there's no witnesses. I mean, it's a large home. You have a person who ended up going to the hospital and passing away, and then someone who has a gun. How do you piece through initially those moments to try and figure out what happened?
Yeah, and it's tough. It's very tough because if the person you may feel is responsible for that person's death invokes their right to have a lawyer, then you're really, not getting much done, but, securing that crime scene, because a lot can be done with the crime scene and the weapon, and then later on with the autopsies and all stuff like that. But when you get into witnesses, you're kind of working backwards with witnesses who know them, not witnesses to the crime, but to the relationship, to their maybe state of mind going into that night. So that's what you got to try to do. But it becomes very difficult, like you said, when there's only two people there and then trying to figure out what happens. And that's why, detectives want a preserved crime scene and a background of both individuals the best they can get.
She was charged with felony murder, as well as some other charges I'm going to ask you about in just a moment. But why is it in some cases you see there take a considerable amount of time to actually land a charge like that on somebody, but then in this case where there are no witnesses, officers are able to charge someone with murder?
Well, it depends what she said. To the responding officers, to the detectives or whatever, her statements, I don't think have been put out there, and for good reason. You don't want to do that, but you don't know what she said initially, what the responding officers actually saw once they got there. Was she standing over the body holding the gun? There's a lot of factors that go into it with the timing of when people are charged. If they know immediately right away because of statements or what they observed, then it's a ground ball. The length of time when things get kind of drawn out is when investigations kind of have to get done with cause of death and, motives and all that, is when charges seem to get delayed a little, but it didn't seem that in this case.
Yeah, there's really just the press release and the charges that we have at this point. And we also know a bit about her background. I mean, she was an incredibly successful dentist, it seems, owned a practice on a very well-to-do island here in Georgia. How common are these cases that you've come across? I mean, I know domestic violence comes across in all shapes and forms and all backgrounds, but to have it be someone who professionally had it together, it seems, on every level, lived in this incredibly nice home, but then to have it go in this direction, how common have you seen that in your career?
Well, you nailed it. There is no parameters into domestic violence, and that's the sad part of it. You could be rich, you could be poor, you could be in the best neighborhood in the world or the poorest neighborhood in the world, and domestic violence is horrible and it happens all the time. But the one thing I want to say is, the upfront persona of her and how she handles herself might not be what's going on behind the scenes. So a lot of people may give the impression of, oh my gosh, she was great, she was happy, she was great, nothing was going on. When in fact, you may talk to people down the road where, her home life was very dark, or the couple's life was very dark. So that's when you get into those background interviews that are going to take place with this.
And it's unclear who her attorney is at this point, but I always think about like the Law and Order episodes, and I know that might be annoying for you having worked when people start bringing up Law and Order, because I know that that's not the real world, but I imagine the person who can bring in a very successful, expensive attorney at this stage in the investigation. What are some of the challenges that you would face when someone has lawyered up and they have someone who might be restricting your ability to get information to figure out what went on?
Yeah, that's what I mean by, you hit it on the head before. the responding officers, you start preparing for a trial immediately. So when you might have a thought of a high priced lawyer being involved in this because of where she is in her life and what her status is, you really have to do everything by the book, step by step, and make sure there's no screw ups or mishandling evidence or statements without a lawyer present. Any of that is really, really important, because when you have high priced lawyers, they're high priced lawyers for a reason, because they're really good and they know what to look for, how to look for it, and what's going to help their client. And that's what you have to prepare for when you're doing an investigation like this with that type of lawyer.
Will they sit with a suspect in the interview room and then almost play interference on some of the questions that you're asking in those conversations?
It goes both ways. You can have a lawyer that just says they're not talking, we're leaving, goodbye. Or if they're being held, we're not talking to anyone. The lawyer may talk for them. So you're kind of going over everything with the lawyer about what you have, and the DA that's assigned to this case would be there as well. And then there's other times that they have them sit in on it for a brief moment just to hear what's going on. But there's different avenues that they can go and strategies that defense attorneys use.
And when you have those initial conversations inside the house and you're searching for evidence, what are some of the clues? And again, we don't know what she said. Hopefully we'll hear from law enforcement, get more information, maybe one day have the body cam video of when they first responded. But what can you go through to see whether it was self-defense, if that's going to be her argument, whether that carries any weight, or whether this was something where she came home, she was upset for whatever was going on in their lives, whatever that may be, and then turned to violence to try and solve it?
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris, because the one thing you want to do is the condition of the house. Did it look like there was a fight? Is anything broken? The position of the body, where the body is and where the shooting took place. All that leads into what detectives are going to put together a timeline of what happened that night and where it happened and how it happened. And those initial views of those responding officers, as I said before, are so crucial, because they're going to be the ones setting the investigation in motion with what they observed or what they heard or what the suspect said at the time.
I looked at her social media, and there was one post that she had, and it was actually on her business's Facebook page, but it showed her at a gun range doing some target practice. I don't know how experienced she was, but she at least had that one picture that she seemed to be someone who knew how to handle a firearm. How common is it that you see the licensed, practiced gun owner actually turn to violence in these cases?
Well, it depends why she got it. That's when I mentioned before about going into the background of this. Did anyone know she had a permit? Did her husband know she had a permit? That gets hidden sometimes. Did she get it because of something she was thinking about later on, or just to protect herself in that environment and outside? Those are the steps of the investigation that they're going to go through with maybe other social media posts and friends and family interviews. So that might be something that may come up later on with why she had it and the reasonings for having a permit or a pistol permit. Yeah.
Another moment that just in your experience, if you could take us inside of, because sometimes at Law&Crime we'll get body cam video, but we'll also get the backseat video when a suspect has been arrested, and it's kind of this like quiet moment where you're watching them being driven to jail. And I imagine for this woman, and we don't know much about her at this point other than her business background, but lived in a great home, had this business that seemed to be going really well, and then suddenly is facing a reality where she could spend the rest of her life in prison. What's it like for you as the officer driving that car when you've arrested someone who's facing and coming to terms with that reality, when it's really just you and them in the car driving to a county jail?
Yeah, well, I give you both views. As a patrol cop, you want to observe how they're acting. Is she taking deep breaths and seems sort of relieved? Or is she really upset? Those things are going to be the first thing that me as a detective are going to ask that officer. How is she acting? Did she say anything? What was her demeanor in the back seat? So all of that is going to lead to a possible motive or questions that are going to arise later on. So those are really important. That's a great point, by both the officer and detective later on.
And one thing I also noticed in the interview process, and this is more a general question as instead of this case, but the old good cop, bad cop type, is there truth to that? Because there are some officers you'll see who are incredibly comforting in the interview process. And then you can tell when the mood changes, when maybe it's the second interview and the person comes in and they're taking more of a hardline approach and trying to figure things out.
Yeah, believe it or not, it is a strategy and it does work. But the different levels of the good and the bad depend on the case, depend on the person you're talking to. Those are, when you go to that strategy, are a lot of times extreme cases that you need that to be done, because you have to change the tempo when it comes to interviews, especially when you have someone that's maybe not helping out or not being cooperative. So those tactics do take place, as well as a female detective or a male detective. Those are also another strategy that might have been used or can be used later on. One of the things that we used to do is bring different people in to ask them, hey, I wasn't here yesterday. Could you repeat what you talked about yesterday, and see if the stories are consistent? So there's a lot of interview strategies that take place when you have someone that's willing to talk. If she lawyers up, then no one's talking to her. But if it is someone that is willing to have a conversation with you, there's many tactics that can be done, and talented detectives can use everything in their toolbox.
Yeah, and going back to the point about lawyering up and preparing for a trial as soon as you step onto the scene, how soon can the charges be challenged, or do you see the charges challenged by someone who's lawyered up, or maybe you initially know, okay, this is a felony murder case, she allegedly shot her live-in boyfriend, that is a murder charge, but then there's more investigating that needs to be done. You're going to need to look at the social media, maybe text messages, to see what was going on in the relationship. How much time do you have to get more evidence before an attorney might go to a judge and say that these charges should be dropped?
Well, the investigation always goes on. They're going to have their arraignment, and she's going to plead, guilty or not guilty through her lawyer, and that has to take place. That's going to take place, and then once that is done, then DAs and defense attorneys usually sit down and talk about what they got. And they're usually cordial conversations. Detectives might be in there at the time as well, of just, hey, what are we looking at? What do we got? One side will present what they have, and the defense attorney will say, well, I have this. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth with this, but investigations don't stop because, the trial process or the criminal justice system starts. This is going to go on until it doesn't need to go on anymore. So, people can come forward, witnesses can come forward, and evidence can be found throughout this entire process. So it is always ongoing until it's ended.
She is charged with not just felony murder, but there's an aggravated assault charge under a Georgia law that's called the Family No Violence Act. And I know you worked in New York, but when charges are added on, and I know each state can be different when it comes to different domestic violence laws that are in place, what's the point of adding those additional charges on top of one that would put her in prison for the rest of her life?
Well, it's just more to add to it. It's more of a bargaining chip. So, it just adds more time to her charges. And you know what? You have to, if they're blatant and it's chargeable, you're going to do it because it's just part of the process. It may not add that much. You're already looking at a murder charge, which is the highest you can get. And the additional charges are ones that just have to go on because to back up the murder charge, so they're more contributing factors when it comes to additional charges to strengthen the main charge that she's going to be charged with.
And just lastly, I keep going back because we've looked at the home that she lived in and the business that she's had, and just what a change from going to sleep in that house to now being held without bond in a county jail. What does life look like as she awaits trial if she's, continues to be held without bond?
Yeah, it's going to be tough. She's going to be held there. She's not going to get out. Unless our lawyer is really, really talented, but we'll see how that plays out. But, reality sets in after a while when you're sitting in a cell for a while, and that is what detectives rely on. You want, suspects or prisoners at this point to get stressed out and be willing to talk and give something up. And the DAs as well. That's why the constant communication is so needed with defense attorneys and DAs to see if you can get a plea bargain, see if you can get an admission of guilt. So it's going to be very stressful for her, but looking at it on the law enforcement side, you kind of welcome that because that's when things start to happen.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. This is just the beginning of this case, but it's certainly a fascinating one. Tom Smith, always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Mericle is currently being held without bond in Hall County, Georgia. That is where this crime allegedly took place. We'll stay on top of this story. For On the Case, presented by Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart.